Thanks for joining us this morning on Wednesday, Hump Day, and an important day for the state in the sense that the state of emergency will finally be over. Well, over by technicality, because at around about midday today, a new bill is introduced into state parliament by the government, and due to their numbers, I think fair to say, pushed through fairly quickly. Which will replace the current state of emergency that's been in place for so long here in Western Australia. Now, on the program yesterday, we did touch base with WA Liberal leader David Honey, who at that stage yesterday morning hadn't had a chance to see this bill. It's called the Emergency Management Bill. But that was rectified at around about 6 o'clock last night, yesterday evening. The Liberal leader and the rest of the opposition have had a chance to have a look at the bill, and he joins us on the program. David, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Liam, and good morning to your listeners.
So better late than never, I suppose, but having had a chance overnight to have a read and pore through it, what are your first thoughts?
Liam, this is just appalling. I mean, I won't go through the process issue because it'll take up too much time, but, you know, to misuse Parliament like this is a disgrace in itself for something that's so important. But look, this, the Premier is stating that this is going to end the state of emergency. I mean, this is just some sort of Orwellian doublespeak by the Premier. The state of emergency will not end. This Act simply continues the state of emergency under another name. But it's much worse than that. This gives unprecedented power to the State Emergency Coordinator, who is or Commissioner, I should say, who is the Police Commissioner. Just unimagined powers, and I think most people in the state would be absolutely shocked.
Well, such as what? What does it say about what they can do?
Now, under the state and under the amendments that were made to the existing State Emergency Management Act at the start of the COVID pandemic, the police were given certain powers, but those were all subject ultimately to scrutiny by the Executive of Government through the Premier and then through Parliament. Under this bill, the State Emergency Coordinator will be able to declare an emergency of their own volition. They only have to consult with the Chief Medical Officer to declare a 3-month emergency period. And that's the only person they have to consult with. They don't actually have to agree with the advice given by the Chief Health Officer. Once they've declared this an emergency, they can then nominate police officers who are responsible for carrying out the duties under the emergency laws. Those laws can include seizing your car, Liam, seizing your house. In fact, they can break into both of those under these acts. They can direct any person to do anything that they consider reasonable to deal with that particular concern that they have. Well, now, none of that, they don't have to give any reason for that, and none of that is subject to any scrutiny by the Executive of Government or Parliament or a minister. It's purely at the volition of the State Emergency Coordinator.
And the State Emergency Coordinator is an unelected public servant.
Absolutely. So you're giving a public servant the most enormous powers. Normally when you give public servants some sort of delegated power, these are minor things. It may be, issuing a license and things like this. But the powers under this Act are just the most draconian powers you can imagine. The Premier's described them as draconian powers and justified them at the height of the COVID crisis that they were necessary. We're heading at the end of the COVID crisis. I cannot comprehend that any Parliament would allow these powers to be given to a public servant with no parliamentary oversight at all. The coordinator doesn't even have to give any reason for what he or she, in this case it would be a he, is doing.
So the State Emergency Coordinator remains as Police Commissioner. Is that locked in?
I'm assuming so, Liam, and that's a detail I'm happy for someone to correct me on, but that is usually the case in emergencies, that the police are the senior service in those matters.
So they can declare an emergency period, and that lasts, 3 months?
3 months. They don't have to seek any advice for anything that they do inside that period. So they can apply all of the powers, and these are enormous powers to do all sorts of things. For example, they could decide to set interstate border closures. So, for example, you'd recall early in the COVID pandemic, you couldn't move between the southwest and Perth, or you couldn't move into the northwest or go into Aboriginal communities. They could decide to cancel all public events. Now, I'm not saying they're going to do this, but they're the powers they have, but with no oversight by a minister, the Premier or Parliament.
But surely this should be linked back to health, because this is a public health issue.
Well, absolutely, and that's supposed to be the guise for it, and that is that, or the reason for it, I should say, and that is that this relates to the COVID emergency. But in the matters that the coordinator has to consider, they have to consider health issues, but they're also considering economic and social issues as well. Now, I cannot comprehend how you would delegate those considerations to a public servant without any oversight from Parliament,
well, or
the Premier or the Executive.
That's a very broad ambit, isn't it? It's a very broad ambit.
Yes.
So you're talking about taking control of personal vehicles and also entering a home under these powers. That's completely separate from being able to have a warrant or anything else.
Absolutely. The police officer can make that decision. They can do those things. Now, for example, and you can see where this might be proper when you've got a pandemic, and I might say you previously, under the existing Act, you had oversight ultimately through the Premier and through to Parliament. But the Optus Stadium was used as a coordination centre at the start of the pandemic, and that was used. You can see that was appropriate at the start of the pandemic, but to hand that power over to a public servant, however good that person is, Liam, this is as much a matter of principle as a matter of fact, if you know what I mean. That you would hand that over willy-nilly is just beyond my comprehension. Our view is very clear. Look, we called some time ago for the end of the state of emergency. The Premiers and apparently the Labor Party are playing some sort of game that, well, if we oppose this bill, we're opposing the end of the state of emergency. Let's make it very clear. We think the state of emergency is over. This is now a public health issue, not a police issue. And that's the way it should be treated under the Public Health Act, which itself has extensive powers.
Well, look, in the final analysis at midday today, I mean, the government could just ram this through because the numbers are such that, no offence, but you and your coalition colleagues are inconsequential.
Look, they will ram it through, Liam, and that's what they've done. I mean, the way this has been introduced, I mean, imagine giving us a briefing on something as complex as this. We only get a briefing at 6 o'clock, just shortly before we got copies of the bill. We're still in Parliament doing normal business until, 8 o'clock last night. And somehow we're supposed to understand the bill, form a view on it, consult with the community and interested stakeholders, and then go and debate it in Parliament. I mean, they treat Parliament with contempt. This is another example.
Well, as I say, the debate's irrelevant, isn't it? David, thank you very much for joining us to tell us about that. That's concerning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Liam, and good morning to your listeners.
David Honey there, the leader of the Liberal Party. And it's very interesting, isn't it? It's got to be concerning if there's no parliamentary oversight or ministerial oversight of these declarations. I was assuming that was the whole point of getting rid of the state of emergency so we could come back to having some form of accountability at that level.